During the Trump era, politics is infiltrating just about every aspect of our government, including institutions like the Supreme Court and the Justice Department that are supposed to be apolitical. Now, we've already seen how Attorney General William Barr, he's worked to help President Trump and his supporters like Roger Stone. In fact, critics are saying that Barr, he's acting like the president's personal law firm. And now the Supreme Court is being accused of putting its thumb on the scale for the president. And that criticism, it is coming from one of its own. I'm talking about Justice Sonia Sotomayor. Now, this all flared up when Sotomayor issued a dissenting opinion after the High Court sided with the administration on the public charge rule, which requires a wealth test for immigrants who want to come here or stay here legally. Now, I'm going to read from her scathing dissenting opinion, and I quote, "Claiming one emergency after another, the government has recently sought stays in an unprecedented number of cases, demanding immediate attention and consuming limited court resources in each. And with each successive application, of course, its cries of urgency rise increasingly hollow. It is hard to say what is more troubling, that the government would seek this extraordinary relief seemingly as a matter of course, or that the court would grant it." Now, Sotomayor had more to say, quote, "I fear that this disparity in treatment erodes the fair and balanced decision-making process that this court must strive to protect." Earlier today, Andrew spoke with Garrett Epps. He's a professor of constitutional law at the University of Baltimore. He's also a contributing editor at The Atlantic.
Garrett, Justice Sonia Sotomayor issuing a warning from the bench that cases are moving to the Supreme Court too fast, that the court is allowing emergency petitions and allowing the White House to skip various other courts, and that in doing so they're putting their thumb on the scale for the White House. First of all, how unusual is it for Justice Sotomayor or any justice to give a warning that stark about the actions of their own court?
Well, it's not historically unprecedented, but it isn't the normal the normal collegiality. And I think that we should realize that this court is like the nation as a whole. Collegiality is wearing quite thin there, and the judges in the liberal minority are feeling quite pressed by some of the conduct of the majority. And I think she is really angry. And Sotomayor has during her tenure been someone who is less inhibited about expressing her objection to the way the court is operating. But that doesn't mean she's not speaking for any of the others.
Let's get to the meat of her argument again, that cases are going to the court too fast, that they're skipping a number of other courts with these emergency requests, and that it's tantamount to a thumb on the scale for President Trump. Do you agree with her assessment of what's been happening, her observations? And then do you also agree with her analysis of those observations?
I don't think there's any question that the court has begun to grant these emergency applications at a higher rate than it did before. Couple that with the fact that the Solicitor General's office is using the emergency stay petition much more than it used to. Professor done some very interesting statistical studies showing that, really it's being used by this administration maybe 3 or 4 times as often as by the most recent ones, Republican or Democratic, because it was considered to be heretofore a kind of stake of the administration's credibility, and saying to the court, this really is an emergency. We really do need you to step in, and that sort of marker has kind of gone by the board. It seems as if any time the administration loses a high-profile case in the lower courts, it's going to run immediately to the Supreme Court to ask for relief. And the grounds seem to me to be remarkably thin. They're both basically saying the government will be irreparably harmed if it can't do what it wants right away, which is really contrary to the normal principle of judicial review, the fundamental axiom being that the court must review decisions for legality. So, yes, I think it is. And I think what people don't realize is that these emergency stays put pressure on the lower courts. They are a signal that 5 justices think that the government is likely to win when the case gets to the Supreme Court. It's a fairly powerful signal, and one that has kind of shadowed all of litigation because it doesn't seem to be applied even-handedly. And I can give you an example, which is the case coming out of Texas are trying to take the entire Affordable Care Act down. They want to destroy the entire Affordable Care Act as unconstitutional. That case, they have succeeded so far at the Fifth Circuit, and the states have asked the court to expedite review of this. They said, this is really quite important. We need to know whether there's going to be an Affordable Care Act or not a year from now. And the court has refused to expedite that case. We'll hear it next term. Now, by coincidence, what that means is that the Affordable Care Act will not be invalidated before the November election. And of course, that issue is really quite important to the White House. So an observer can be forgiven by saying, there's a thumb on the scales, and that thumb leans toward one of the two political parties, and it's a disturbing thing for someone who, believes in judicial review as a uniquely American institution.
Well, Garrett, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers are thinking to themselves, boy, I can think of some Democratic emergencies or emergencies from Democrats that might have gotten or qualified for special treatment by the Supreme Court, particularly when it comes to impeachment or when it came to impeachment and impeachment witnesses. Do we know if there were any tests from Democrats beyond the one you mentioned with the Affordable Care Act, or any hint from the court as to whether they would have been inclined to give emergency status to those cases?
I don't know whether the members of Congress filed emergency petitions or not. I think that certainly none were granted, and the fact of the matter is that the lower courts have been content to proceed with these at a stately pace, so that the Supreme Court didn't really get caught in the crosshairs on that because the cases were kind of bubbling along. And I think if I were counsel, I would have made the judgment that it doesn't make sense to ask the Supreme Court to take those cases away from the lower courts. I think it would have been a high-risk play.
Now, we do have two trends happening at the same time. First is the conservative consolidation of the majority on the court, particularly with Kavanaugh replacing Kennedy. At the same time, you also have Trump's rise both in the White House and his spread in our national politics. Is there any indication, is there any way to know whether the Supreme Court is just acting on either one of those trends or feeling the impact of both at the same time?
This is something your viewers have heard a dozen times, I'm sure, in the last month, but you have to keep your eye on the Chief Justice. We've got 4 conservative justices on the court who seem basically to be willing to do anything that the Republican Party wants, and basically almost anything the administration wants. And the Chief Justice has indicated that he feels 2 things. One is some independence from the administration, which explains his vote in the census case, but also that he resents the attack, and the attack is fierce and being escalated, the attack on judicial independence, the attack on the lower courts, the kind of thing that has been happening to Judge Jackson in the Roger Stone trial, where the president and his political allies are attacking her personally and using threatening behavior. Stone himself put up a meme on Twitter with crosshairs on the next to the judge. And Chief Justice Roberts is alarmed by this. He expressed that alarm. I don't know of a Chief Justice who's ever responded to a presidential statement the way he did to President Trump's tweets about a Trump judge. And then, he issued a very subdued but pointed rebuke to the administration in his end-of-year message. And so, it's possible. I mean, I suppose anything is possible. It's possible that one of the other 4 will begin to say, look, you guys are going too far. We don't work for you. But at the moment, it certainly seems like Justices Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh do work for the White House, and we don't see much signs of independence from them.
If Chief Justice Roberts was the institutionalist who was concerned about making sure the court doesn't become seen as over-politicized, he could easily have stopped these emergency cases from going all the way to the court and just said, with a no vote, it would have gone through the normal processes. Are you reading anything into the fact that the Chief Justice has not stopped some of these cases from jumping lower courts and going right to the top court?
I think it's quite significant because, a significant amount of the decision a judge is supposed to make on this kind of petition is what's called the likelihood of success on the merits. That is, do you think that when the case reaches your court, you will vote the way the government wants you to vote? So, Chief Justice Roberts is an institutionalist, but he is and always has been not only a very strong conservative, but an advocate of very sweeping executive power. So that in these cases, he almost has to disagree with himself if he wants to put a spoke in the wheels of the administration's wagon, and he hasn't done that so far.
Garrett Epps is a professor of constitutional law at the University of Baltimore. He's also a contributing editor at The Atlantic. Garrett, appreciate a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. When we come back, President Trump continues his post-impeachment revenge tour by getting rid of people on a quote-unquote hit list that he's reportedly putting together. After the break, we'll explain.